Hi everyone, welcome to our podcast. I am Jaswant Singh.
I'm Kashmir. Today we're talking about a very important issue in Canadian criminal justice, the use of mandatory minimum sentences, especially for cases where someone fires a gun at a house.
We are focusing on an article by Meller from 2023 called Mandatory Minimum Penalty for Firing Gun at House Unconstitutional. The article discusses a recent decision by Supreme Court of Canada which ruled that a mandatory minimum sentence in kind of case is unconstitutional. That means the law forcing judges to give a fixed minimum sentences was struck down.
This is really important because mandatory minimum sentences are supposed to make the justice system more consistent and act as a deterrent, but at the same time, they take away a judge's ability to consider the unique circumstances for each case. Our main research question is how closely do mandatory minimum sentences follow the principle of fairness, proportionality, and protection against cruel and unusual punishment?
Our argument is that mandatory minimum penalties for firing a gun at house don't really work. They can lead to unfair and excessive punishment, and they ignore the principle that sentencing should be personalized for each offender.
To give a bit of context, in Canada, sentencing is guided by a few important principles. First is proportionality, which means the punishment should fit both the crime and the offender's responsibility. Second is individualization, which means judges need to consider the person's circumstances like their intent, their background, or the actual harm caused. And finally, fairness and restraint, which is all about keeping punishment reasonable and not excessive.
Mandatory minimum sentences clash with these principles because they don't let judges make their decision based on details of each case. For example, someone might fire a gun at house by accident causing no real harm, but under mandatory minimum law, they could face same severe sentence as someone who did with intent or to hurt people. That's where problem starts.
Historically, mandatory minimum sentences were introduced to make the justice system consistent and prevent lenient sentences for serious crimes. But research shows that just making punishments harder does not really stop crime. Deterrence is more about whether people think they will get caught, not how long the punishment might be. So while these laws look tough on crime, they don't actually make communities safer.
And there's a social aspect to long mandatory sentences take people out of their communities for a longer period of times, which is expensive and can even make crime worse. If rehabilitation programs are ignored, resources could be used to programs that actually help reduce reoffending like community support, education, or mental health treatment. Now let's talk about why mandatory minimum sentences are really problematic. First, they take away judicial discretion. Judges can't look at the details of each case or person involved in crime. Proportionality is a key principle in Canadian sentencing. It says that the punishment should match both the seriousness of crime and offender's moral responsibility. Mandatory minimum ignore this. That means someone could get punishment that is way too harsh for what they actually did.
Exactly. And this is especially important with firearm offenses. Firing a gun at a house could be dangerous, or it could be reckless, but not actually cause harm. The law can't treat these situations the same, but mandatory minimums forces judges to do exactly that. The Supreme Court of Canada has made it clear that sentencing must take look into counting the individual circumstances of each offender. By ignoring these differences, mandatory minimum sentences can be unfair and unconstitutional.
Another big problem is that mandatory minimum sentences are ineffective at preventing crime. People often think that the harsher punishments will scare people away from committing crimes, but studies show this is not true. Deterrence comes from chance of getting caught, not the length of sentence. So making sentences longer doesn't actually stop crime.
And there is another side to it. Mandatory minimum sentences can take away resources from programs that actually help reduce reoffending, the rehabilitation programs, community-based support, and mental health services. When prisons are filled with people serving long sentences for reasons that could have been handled differently, it's not really helping society. Instead, it's just creating more problems.
Then there's the issue of disproportionate punishment. Section 12 of Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom protect against cruel and unusual punishment. Mandatory minimum risk violating these because they give same severe punishment to people regardless of whether they meant to harm or not. Courts have pointed out that this is leads to unnecessary imprisonment and does not increase public safety. Some people argue that mandatory minimums are necessary for consistency and deterrence, but we have to remember that fairness and proportionality are more important in justice system.
So overall, mandatory minimum penalties for firing a gun at a house are not really unfair, but they can also make the justice system less effective. They take away judges' ability to decide on a case by case basis, punish people more than they deserve, and don't really make the public safer. That's why the Supreme Court struck down to particular law and why it's such an important issue to study.
Wrap up, we can see that mandatory minimum penalties for firearm offenses like firing gun at house are problematic. They remove judicial discretion, can lead to punishment that are too harsh and don't effectively reduce crime. They also divert resources away from programs that actually help offenders to reintegrate into society.
This case shows us why the Supreme Court of Canada plays an important role in making sure the sentencing respect fairness, proportionality, and individualization. Laws must be balanced public safety with the right individuals.
Understanding this scale help us see the broader principles of Canadian criminal justice system and how courts protect the constitutional rights of offenders while keeping society safe. Thank you for listening to our discussion. We hope it gave you clear understanding of this important issue.